So I was born in New Jersey, the son of a black journalist and a white dental hygienist. And around my 8th grade year, we moved the family to Cleveland, specifically to Shaker Heights, Ohio. Now, Shaker Heights is an east side suburb of about 30,000 people, but a bit of an outsized national reputation. Some people in this room have probably heard of it before. So when you grow up in Shaker, it's the kind of place where people are constantly telling you that you live in a bubble, that once you leave this place, you're never going to find somewhere else that's like it. It's a place that's remarkably socioeconomically and racially diverse. It's the kind of place that while so many of its neighboring communities have experienced massive white flight, that has maintained a 50-50 ratio in its still very good public schools. It was a place that my parents had deliberately moved our biracial family, in part because they wanted their 3 sons to grow up somewhere where they saw not only white achievement, but also black achievement, right? Where it was not odd to me that the most rich person I knew was a black man, the father of my friend, where it was not weird that the mayor might be black or the congresswoman might be black. You know, Shaker is in many ways this cocoon of racial awareness. It's a place that, you know, it has panel discussions about the achievement gap, or in high school, the biggest student organization is called the Student Group on Race Relations, where teenagers get together once a week to talk in each other's living rooms to talk about prejudice or stereotypes, right? Which is not what most of our high school clubs do. You know, given that, you might think that it's obvious or it makes sense that I ended up being the person for the Washington Post who now covers this, right? A national correspondent on race and justice. But it really wasn't the case at all. This wasn't kind of what I intended. What I wanted to do is I wanted to cover politics. Politics were sexy and they were cool, right? I remember watching in 2004 and 2008 and 2012 the tweets and the photos and the stories from the campaign embeds. And I just remember this kind of lusting envy. You know, I wanted to be there. And I spent years, whether it be covering the city council in my college town, or when I got a job at the Boston Globe covering the mayor's race here, and then eventually my first job at the Post covering Congress, I was singularly focused on getting to cover the 2016 presidential race, because I was convinced that 2016, you know, after 8 years of the first black president, was going to be the most substantive and issue-based campaign in my lifetime, and how could I not cover that story? That wasn't what was intended, right? It was kind of happenstance that I ended up doing what I do. In August 2014, I happened to be the reporter who had his bag packed. I had just gotten back from covering a congressional race in Michigan, and an editor walked over and said, "Can you go to this place called Ferguson? It looks like there's some unrest. There's been a police shooting." At the time, I couldn't spell the word Ferguson. I probably couldn't spell Missouri either. I'd never been there, but I got on the airplane because I was smart enough to know that, you know, when the editor brings you a good story, you take it. And I got off my plane just in time to sneak into the last pew of an old church in St. Louis as the family of a young man named Michael Brown gave what was their first ever press conference. That night, I worked the streets. You know, there had been dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of people who had taken to the streets in this place called Ferguson, and they were angry. They had stories to tell. As I interviewed them, I took my notebook out, and as I interviewed them, they told me anecdote after anecdote, story after story, cases of times they've been pulled over, the way everyone here seems to have warrants, these stories of being beat up or being chased down. They increasingly escalated. As I talked to more people, I kept hearing things that seemed so foreign and so violent, so frustrating, so discriminatory, that they almost seemed unbelievable. So much so that day I didn't believe a lot of those stories. Now, you have to remember that 2014, while it was only 2 years ago, was a long time ago in the nation's mind or in our psyche, right? We're now very used to hearing stories like that. We're now used to reading these reports from the Department of Justice that eviscerates police departments, saying that this department we've investigated is discriminatory. These are the various ways they're hurting and preying on their own residents. But at the time, we weren't quite primed for that. I know for me personally, I didn't quite believe that some of these things could have been so bad. Now, this went on for weeks, as you all know, and is still going on. There were hundreds of people in the street. demanding justice, demanding accountability. And they were telling us, especially in this case, specifically about police shootings. They were arguing to us that people were being executed in the streets each day. Unarmed black men were being executed in the streets each day. Now, meanwhile, because we were reporters, we'd call the police, and they'd say, "That's nonsense, that's not happening. We don't kill anybody. We barely ever kill anyone, and when we do, that person certainly had it coming, by the way." Both of those things couldn't be true. It's funny, I talk to my editors now every once in a while, and I have this turn of phrase I use where I talk about how sometimes we report ourselves into more reporting, that after a week of me quoting all these people saying these things, we probably have some obligation to figure out if they're right. And so we embarked on a project to try to answer some of those questions, because at the time, and to date, there's still no federal information about how many people are killed by the police. That was stunning for us when we first kind of figured that out, because who's more powerful than a police officer? It's in fact the most powerful element of our government. Barack Obama can't shoot and kill you. Hillary Clinton can't either, despite what some blogs might tell you. But police officers wield a specific power in our society. And they also are the emissaries of government that people are most likely to interact with. And so we set out to answer this question: how many people are killed by the police? Who are they, and under what circumstances? We combed news reports, we filed records requests, and we built a database. It was a lot of research and a lot of reporting. And after a year of that, we'd done dozens of stories. We'd done pieces about how, so often officers aren't prepared to deal with mentally ill people, who are a quarter of who are killed by the police. We did stories about how, while we're led to believe most officers never fire their weapons, which is probably true, we'd seen in a year at least 60, and what we know is probably far more officers who had killed someone who we know had killed someone previously. And what we saw was that, yes, there are racial disparities in who is being killed by the police. And yes, black men are more likely to be. Now, it's always struck me that those stories should have been more obvious for us. Now, that's not to say they were easy stories. They were not easy stories at all. We spent hours, a team of people that started as a handful of us that swelled to dozens, spent hours crunching data and tracking down anecdotes, right? Finding those humans, those real people who made those stories pop off of the page. So it's not to discount the work, and we appreciate the honors of that work, certainly. But what's bothered me is that those stories, those themes, those angles were not new. The idea of police transparency was not something that was new. The idea that a police department might use fines and fees and warrants as laid out by the Department of Justice was something that had been going on for decades. And the discriminatory adverse effects of that had been going on for decades. Even the idea to count police shootings was not new or original. There were two great citizen journalism projects that had sought to answer this question before: Killed by Police and Fatal Encounters, and they both continue to this day doing great work. And we know police shootings didn't start in 2014. These are things that have been going on forever. In fact, most people who study policing and criminology believe that the police probably kill fewer people today than they ever have before. But what was new in 2014 was the physical manifestation of that anger in our American streets. It was the people so harmed, so upset, coming out and demanding that we pay attention to their stories. Because of that, I've spent 2 years now really wrestling and grappling with personally why I didn't believe those people on that first day. They were there, and they were telling me about their experiences, but why did their stories never make it from the pages of my notebook into the pages of the Washington Post? Some of them did, but most of them didn't. Why was I so skeptical of them? Was it because I'd been raised in an environment in a world that was just so different than theirs? I mean, perhaps it's part of it, right? I grew up in a suburb. I had a lot of privilege that came with that, but that didn't change the color of my skin. I was still black, right? I've been pulled over. I can still remember the sting when I was in 3rd and 4th grade of figuring out that everyone else from the bus stop got to go over to Nico's house to play video games every day after school. And Nico, who was my buddy, just wasn't inviting me. And I just remember him telling me in hushed tones, hey man, like my grandma doesn't really like black people. I can remember as a teenager, as we learned to drive, one of my best friend's mothers pulling us aside and saying that it was important that we always kept our wallet when we were driving in the center console. So that way, when we got pulled over, and it was a when, we got pulled over all the time, we wouldn't have to reach for anything. You know, not long after Ferguson, I went home to Cleveland. I went in part to cover another police shooting, the death of a 12-year-old boy in a park. But I also found myself having conversations now with my parents. And I remember one time sitting in my childhood living room and having what is probably the first full conversation as an adult that I had ever had with the biracial parents who had raised me. And I remember talking to them about their parenting philosophy, and my dad turned to me and he said, you know, noting the fact that we didn't talk a ton about race, but he said, you know, my 3 sons were smart. I never had to tell any of you that you were black. The world was going to let you know that sooner or later. And that really stuck with me, that, you know, sooner or later the world was going to let you know that. That my parents had crafted and made this deliberate decision to put me in a place where I would be taught about race and I would understand race, but that I would never feel limited by my race, that my ambition and my dreams of opportunity would never feel confined by my skin. Now that had dual purposes or dual effects. It empowered me to have the type of ambition and the type of drive to do some of the work that, you know, very fortunately landed me on a stage in a room like this. But what it also did is at times blind me to how deep a reality race is to other people in this country. That as I've now traveled the country for 2 years in places like Ferguson or Baltimore, Charleston, and Milwaukee, this understanding that for so many black Americans, race remains the most defining characteristic and the most defining factor of their life. I don't need the statistics to tell me that anymore because I have the notebooks full of their stories that tell me that. I think that physical manifestation in the street, that anger and that overpouring of trauma forced me as a reporter and me as a person and us as an industry to grapple with what I think might still be one of our biggest institutional biases. And it's not our liberal media bias, and it's not our anti-Hillary Clinton bias, right? It's the bias that we believe that the system works, and that the system works for everyone equitably. You remember what people were saying those first days in Ferguson: let things play out, let the system play out, it'll all work. But that only works if the system does. And what we know, and what history tells us, is that while there have been several decades of good faith efforts at reforming and creating an equitable criminal justice system, we know that that same system for 400 years was never intended to yield equity. How and what is our role as journalists and reporters to probe the successes and the failures of 40 years of reform at undoing 400 years of inequity? Now, I think that remains the important tenet of the journalism we do as it relates to holding people accountable. I think that too often, in part because it's our job to talk to these official sources, we turn our skeptical eye not on the police officer, but rather on the dead 18-year-old in the street. And I think that we have to remember that our job is to apply pressure to power, not to the powerless. I think that we have to grapple with what our role is as journalists and as reporters to not only tell these stories after the fact, but to identify them before the fact. And what we know to be true is that most times when our official sources, when our police chiefs and our politicians and their unions insist to us that there is nothing there, that almost always means there is something there. Now, I certainly don't have all the answers as to how we do this and how we continue to do this. By the time I finish this speech, I will have figured out all the things that I just said and how they are wrong, right? But what I think is important, and one of the things I think is important that we learn from these last 2 years, is that these stories exist It shouldn't take a tragedy for us to see those stories. And that the key to unlocking this type of revelatory work is really simple. It's being in those streets and believing those people. Thank you guys for having me today.